Alec Murdaugh. It's been a while since we've mentioned his name, but he is back in the news because the South Carolina Supreme Court is going to hear his argument of jury tampering. The lower court already said, no, we don't think anything. We're going to pass this off to other courts. And that's exactly where it has gone. Joining me to discuss, Eric Faddis, defense attorney, former prosecutor. Yeah, so we're going to the Supreme Court with this case. It sounds big. It sounds exciting. It sounds like something really big could happen here. Is it as big as it possibly could be? What are your takes on this, Eric?
I'm leaning towards yes, and in part because the Supreme Court is going to hear this. My understanding is that they kind of jumped an appellate court. Usually, you would go up the chain and
Hmm.
go trial court, appellate court, Supreme Court. Here, the Supreme Court is signaling that this is such an important issue with possible precedential effect that they're going to hear it and listen to it seriously. So we could have a new trial on our hands depending on how this proceeding goes.
It's an interesting one because the trial, for the most part, I think went pretty smoothly. But then it's one of these things where after the fact, you learn some pieces. And look, love him or hate him, and I think most people are in the hate him camp. Everybody is entitled to a fair and impartial jury of their peers. And if there was jury tampering by Becky Hill, which you have one juror saying flat out, yes, there was. You have several others I know that are saying, never heard it. This never happened. But you got 12 people in there. It's reasonable to understand and think that, well, maybe one or some heard this and others did not, or took something one way or the other. How do you determine, what's valid here when you have like more than half saying no, and then you got this one over here saying, yeah, this definitely happened. Obviously, the lower court said, yeah, we don't care.
When you look at potential grounds for appeal, sometimes you're saying, oh, the court let in some text messages when they shouldn't or whatever. That's sort of one quantum of appeal. But when we're talking about jury tampering, all courts take that extremely seriously. And even a small indication of jury tampering can't be enough to win the day and get a conviction overturned or get a new trial. And so even though there is all of these jurors saying we didn't hear anything like that, one juror said they did, and it'll be interesting to see how the Supreme Court analyzes the effect of Becky Hill's alleged statements to that juror and whether it is enough to have this thing start all over.
What are the options that the Supreme Court has here at the end of the day once they hear this case?
The Supreme Court could say that, hey, there was no, we hear you, Alec, but there was no significant problem. We don't think the evidence is overwhelming. The other jurors were on board. We're going to do nothing, and the convictions will be maintained. That's one option. A second option is that the Supreme Court will say, no, this jury tampering is significant. We're going to give you a new trial without Becky Hill, so we can ensure that there is no such problem in the subsequent trial. A third option would be to just vacate the conviction entirely, especially if the court finds what's called structural error, saying that the process was just so contaminated with Becky Hill's actions that Alec Murdaugh shouldn't face, he shouldn't even face a new trial and should just get off.
With all that being said, if there is a new trial of Alec Murdaugh, um, there's a lot of things that seem to have sunk him in the first one. The financial crimes were brought into it, and that seemed to be pretty damning. Him on the stand was also pretty damning. That's not to say that this next round we're going to have all those same pieces. If we had Alec Murdaugh trial 2.0 with no financial crimes being brought up, do you think we're going to end up with the same conviction that we had the first time?
It's hard to say. Those financial crimes really, I think, caused the jury to disbelieve Alec Murdaugh, even though he was allegedly upfront about him on the stand. He had lied about him for years,
Mhm.
swindling clients, engaging in deceptive behavior, and I think the jury, in part, took that to mean that they shouldn't believe his testimony about the murder. If those financial crimes are out of it, which I think is unlikely, it strengthens Alec Murdaugh's ability to present a defense. But there are sentences in other financial crime cases hanging over his head anyway. So even if he gets this murder case somehow tossed out, he's still looking at decades in prison on the other case.
Without a doubt. But do they have to bring up these financial crimes in this trial? Because it really, I suppose you could make an argument that maybe they do come into play. I guess I would almost think more so on the defense of Alec Murdaugh, if anything else, if they want to go down a road of it's a third party culprit and it was somebody trying to get revenge on him for those crimes. But again, you'd have to then bring that into court. Um, is this something where it's guaranteed that those are going to be admitted into a second trial if there is one?
I think it's very likely for a few reasons. One is because Alec Murdaugh has given prior sworn testimony about this. So even if there's a subsequent trial and he doesn't testify, the prosecution could potentially use that sworn testimony and introduce it against him. And I think that prosecution might have the theory that the walls were closing in financially on Alec Murdaugh, and I guess that somehow went to his motive to kill his family and get the attention off the financial crimes is one theory I've
Mhm.
heard, not the most compelling in my opinion, but I think the prosecution is going to try to get it in there anyway because it makes Alec Murdaugh look so bad.
Yeah. Precedent setting. We were talking about that a little bit earlier, where they could say, you know what, we don't think this is that big of a deal. We think it all went good. You're going back to where you came from. Yeah, there was a problem here with the jury and tampering, and we need to evaluate it. Either way, a precedent is set. That's not a very good precedent if the Supreme Court is going to say, well, in this case, we had one juror that is claiming this. We have Becky over here that's saying this. And there's some pretty strong evidence of jury tampering that did happen here. Um, but then to just say, no, we're not going to do anything about it, that doesn't seem like a Supreme Court move to me.
And that's what Alec Murdaugh's attorneys are saying in their motion for a new trial too. So at the trial court level, we're talking about legal standards to overturn a conviction. Trial court is essentially saying, hey, this one juror that wouldn't have changed the outcome here. It wouldn't have resulted in a not guilty verdict. But the defense is saying, hey. So what? Even if that's true, the jury tampering alone is so problematic, so antithetical to a person's right to a fair trial that you have to give great weight to that and overturn it, even if that standard of having a different outcome, but for Becky Hill is not met. And so the Supreme Court is going to wrestle with what that appropriate standard is to get a new trial.
What is that? What is the burden of proof that needs to be met here? I mean, if you have one juror raising their hand, which we already do, when we were evaluating this earlier, we're like, if there's one that says yes, this happened, that's pretty damning. And you do have one saying yes, this happened. Is that it? Is that the burden? Or I mean, do we need to have further proof that Becky said these things in some way, shape, or form? I don't know where you get that or how you would get that, other than you got the one person saying it.
So a big part of the motion defense's motion to the Supreme Court is a dispute about what the appropriate standard is. Typically, the standard is like if something bad happened, if we take that out of the equation, would that have resulted in a different outcome? So, meaning if Becky Hill hadn't have done this, would Alec Murdaugh be found not guilty? The trial court judge who did the hearing said no, that standard's not met. He still would have been found guilty. But defense is asking for the federal standard, which is a little more lenient, and which kind of says like if there is some substantial jury tampering and there's a reasonable likelihood of affecting the outcome, which it could have. Like this juror, could have resulted in a mistrial or something if Becky Hill had not been involved. And so they're grappling in terms of what that standard is going to be, and the Supreme Court is, I guess, going to tell us.
Are there further legal repercussions that could befall Becky Hill, depending on what happens here with the Supreme Court?
Well, jury tampering itself is a very serious felony crime that there's a potential she could be charged with that. It's my understanding that in her book, she engaged in plagiarizing and I think has made a tacit admission to that.
Uh huh.
And that was for financial gain. Is there some kind of fraud charge that could be brought? Are there administrative consequences? She's already lost her job and will probably never be rehired within that sort of legal capacity.
Hmm.
So a number of negative outcomes that she's facing, the most concerning of which is a possible jury tampering charge.
Well, and with a possible jury tampering charge, I mean, this is something where we talked about it months ago when all this was going on, of implications for other cases. Did she do this? Was this is kind of how she operated, around the court? We were looking at the same sort of issues with, again, Karen Reed and Proctor, where it's like now they got to take a critical look at all of those cases that he was involved in as well. So one person's decisions and one person's just kind of, here's my MO, here's how I operate, can have far reaching beyond just the single case that we're talking about right now. The obviously the lower court already said no, move this on. But if the Supreme Court says game on here again, is that going to force them to relook at all those cases that Becky Hill was involved in?
Tony, there absolutely could be kind of a cascading effect onto other prior cases in which Becky Hill may have been involved. And I'll tell you, I used to be, I did a legal clerkship for a judge. And so I was kind of in the chambers. I was behind the scenes and I didn't see any jury tampering, but did I see some things that were questionable? Did I see court staff taking positions on cases? Did I see them, discussing those positions? Do I know whether they talked with jurors? I don't know.
Mhm.
To think that it's just completely sterile and neutral back there and 100% impartial, I think would be a misconception.
And is that just because people are people? I mean, this sort of thing just kind of, I mean, really realistically go on all the time to one extent or the other. We have a microscope on this case, so every single action is being dissected. Is it common practice for that?
It is in part people being people. You're gonna talk about your work.
Yeah.
You're gonna do that with coworkers and people involved in the process. Thankfully, I have not seen many examples where it rises to something legally problematic.
Yeah.
But when it does, they're gonna take that very seriously, and they're gonna look at any contact she may have had with prior cases in which there was a conviction.
What's your prediction? Are we going to see Alec Murdaugh trial, the sequel?
If I was the judge, I would grant a new trial, as unpopular as that might
Mhm.
be. I think that, oftentimes we're dealing with important legal issues and unpopular characters, unsavory folks. In Colorado, the Chuck E. Cheese murders in the 90s, Nathan Dunlap, his case has actually led to a ton of reform in the legal, in the state of law in Colorado.
Mhm.
And that very well could happen here with Alec Murdaugh and him getting a possible new trial.
Hey, thanks for checking out the video. Be sure to follow us wherever you download podcasts, and especially Apple Podcasts, where you can get advanced episode and premium content on our premium channel right there. Also, be sure to follow us on social media so you don't miss any breaking updates on the stories that matter to you most. We're on TikTok, X, Instagram, Facebook. Just search Hidden Killers Podcast with Tony Brueski, and you'll find us right there. Again, thanks for watching.